The 2026 World Cup was supposed to be the biggest celebration football has ever staged. 48 teams, 3 host nations, a tournament built to bring the world together. But for one team, the experience has looked nothing like a celebration at all. And now, after weeks of formal complaints and public frustration, something has actually changed. Picture this, a flight that should take roughly 40 minutes, a distance of just over 100 miles, and instead, 5 full hours of travel, security checks, and immigration processing, undertaken the day before a World Cup match and repeated immediately after it. That's what Iran's national team has been living through since this tournament began. So what's really happening here, and why has the situation just shifted in Iran's favor days before their final group game? Let's break it down. Start with the background, because understanding exactly what Iran's squad has been dealing with is essential to appreciating why this latest development matters so much. Iran qualified for this World Cup on merit, like every other nation in the competition, earning their place through a qualifying campaign that by any normal standard should have set them up for a tournament experience identical to every other participating country. Group G placed them alongside Belgium, Egypt, and New Zealand, a genuinely competitive draw that gave Iran a realistic chance of advancing if they could prepare and perform at their best. Instead, Iran entered this World Cup in a situation no team has faced in the tournament's history. Their country had been engaged in a 3-month military conflict involving the United States and Israel, with a formal truce only recently reached before the tournament began. That backdrop alone made Iran's participation logistically complicated from the very start. Originally, the plan had Iran's squad based in Tucson, Arizona, like any other competing nation preparing on American soil. That arrangement would have allowed Iran's coaching staff to set up training facilities, build a routine, and prepare for matches under conditions broadly comparable to every other team in the tournament. But at the last minute, those plans changed entirely, and the team was forced to relocate its entire base camp to Tijuana, Mexico instead. That relocation wasn't a minor inconvenience. It meant every single time Iran needed to travel to a match inside the United States, they were crossing an international border, not just a state line. FIFA's own tournament regulations, specifically Article 18.3, state that teams should travel from their base camp to the match venue one day before match day and return to their base camp after the match. For every other nation in this tournament, that's a routine logistical instruction, the kind of detail that barely registers because crossing from a training base to a stadium typically involves nothing more than a short coach journey within the same country. For Iran, it became something else entirely, a process involving passport control, customs, and security screening every single time, layered on top of all the normal demands of preparing for a World Cup match. Here's where things get interesting, because the human cost of this arrangement became impossible to ignore almost immediately. Iran's opening match was a 2-2 draw against New Zealand at SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, California, a genuinely creditable result against tournament opposition, given everything the squad had already navigated just to reach kickoff. The charter flight from Tijuana International Airport to Los Angeles International Airport covers roughly 127 miles, a trip that would typically take well under an hour in the air. Team captain Mehdi Taremi said the actual journey took 5 hours once security and immigration checks were factored in. 5 hours for a flight that should have been over before most passengers finished their first cup of coffee. Consider what that means in practical terms for a professional athlete on the eve of a World Cup match. Most national squads arrive at their match venue city with a full day to settle, train lightly, eat properly, and sleep in a stable environment before kickoff. Iran's players instead spent a significant portion of that same window sitting through processing procedures, arriving at their hotel later than planned, and compressing their entire pre-match routine into whatever time remained. None of that shows up in the box score, but anyone who understands elite sports preparation knows it matters. And it wasn't just the journey there. Iran's coach, Amir Ghalenoui, revealed that immediately after the final whistle against New Zealand, his team was told they had to leave the country right away. Speaking through an interpreter, he didn't hide his frustration. "They didn't even give us time to recover," he said. "After the game, they told us we had to leave immediately."
He explained how important recovery time is for any team at this level, and how being asked to board a plane straight back to their Tijuana camp rather than staying overnight in Los Angeles, as most visiting nations would, left his squad genuinely troubled by the entire experience.
Gallinoi went further still, describing his own team afterward as perhaps the most oppressed team in the whole World Cup. That's not a phrase a national team manager uses lightly, especially not at a tournament his federation had been desperate to participate in, despite everything happening between the two countries beforehand. It's worth remembering that Iran's participation itself had been in genuine doubt at various points during the build-up to this tournament, with qualifications secured well before the conflict escalated, leaving the federation determined to compete even as circumstances around them shifted dramatically in the months that followed. But that's only part of the story, because the difficulties extended well beyond travel logistics alone. Several members of Iran's broader traveling delegation, including support staff who play essential roles in preparing the team, were unable to secure the visas needed to enter the United States at all. Star midfielder Mehdi Tarabi reportedly had to make a personal visit to the American consulate in Tijuana just to renew his own visa after Iran's first match, a process most players at this tournament never have to think about once they're already inside the host country. The Iranian Federation also reported that ticket allocations originally promised to the team were revoked, and media access for Iranian journalists covering the tournament faced its own set of restrictions. This matters because every other qualified nation at this World Cup has been operating under a single, consistent set of expectations about how their tournament experience would unfold. Iran, through no fault of its players or coaching staff, found itself navigating an entirely separate and far more complicated set of circumstances, match by match, often with very little advance notice about what the next set of restrictions might look like. It's worth noting that Iran hasn't been entirely alone in facing access difficulties at this tournament, even if their specific situation has been the most extreme. Fans and officials from several other nations have spoken about visa processing delays and entry complications throughout this World Cup cycle, part of a broader pattern that's drawn scrutiny from football federations and supporter groups well beyond Iran's own camp. What sets Iran's circumstances apart is the sheer scale and frequency of the disruption, affecting not just supporters trying to attend matches, but the playing squad itself on every single match day as a fundamental feature of how their tournament has been structured from the outset. The atmosphere inside SoFi Stadium during that opening match reflected just how much tension surrounded Iran's participation. Several hundred members of the Iranian diaspora protested outside the venue, while many fans from that same diaspora community, once inside, turned their backs during the national anthem in a visible gesture of dissent toward their own government back home. At the same time, dozens of fans displayed the lion and sun emblem, the centerpiece of Iran's flag before 1979, with many more wearing it on t-shirts, despite FIFA's own efforts to keep that particular symbol out of the stadium altogether. It made for an extraordinary, layered scene, supporters expressing complicated and sometimes contradictory feelings about the team on the pitch and the country it represents, all happening simultaneously inside a single World Cup venue. This is where the historical comparison becomes worth considering. Previous World Cups have occasionally featured teams whose participation carried political weight, but rarely has a single nation's basic travel logistics, the simple act of getting from a hotel to a stadium and back, become this central a storyline during the tournament itself. FIFA has navigated political sensitivities around hosting decisions before, but the day-to-day operational disadvantage Iran experienced, with a competitor's official base camp located in an entirely different country from the matches it was playing, doesn't have a clean precedent in the tournament's history. Other World Cups have certainly featured their own access controversies. Previous editions have seen disputes over fan visas, media credentialing complications, and the occasional team complaining about unfair scheduling relative to rivals in their group. But those situations typically involved peripheral elements of a team's tournament experience, not the fundamental, repeated act of border crossing required simply to train and compete. Iran's situation effectively meant their team was a guest in two different countries simultaneously throughout the group stage, a circumstance that's genuinely without a clear parallel in the nearly century-long history of this competition. The Football Federation of the Islamic Republic of Iran responded by preparing a formal complaint to FIFA specifically regarding these travel and visa protocols.
Iranian officials argued the restrictions undermined the basic principle of sporting equity, putting their technical preparation and recovery at a structural disadvantage compared to every other team in the competition, none of whom had to cross an international border just to reach their own designated training base.
Now, here's where the story takes its turn, and where Iran's persistence appears to have actually produced a result. Ahead of Iran's third and final group match against Egypt in Seattle on June 26th, there's been a confirmed shift in how the team's entry into the United States is being handled. Rather than the previous pattern, entering the country only the day before a match and being told to leave almost immediately afterward, Iran's squad will now be permitted to enter the United States 2 full days before their game against Egypt. That's a meaningful change in practical terms. It gives the team genuine time to train, recover, and prepare on something closer to the same footing as every other nation left in the competition, rather than compressing an entire matchday cycle into the narrowest possible window. A tenuous memorandum of understanding has reportedly been reached in connection with this shift, though tensions between the two nations remain very much present, even as the most acute hostilities have slowed. It's a cautious, incremental change, rather than a sweeping resolution, but it represents the first tangible adjustment since Iran's campaign began, and it follows weeks of public statements, a formal complaint, and a head coach willing to describe his own team's situation in genuinely stark terms. Let's make this human for a moment, because behind every logistical detail are players who have trained their entire lives for a moment like this. Picture preparing for the biggest match of your career, only to know that the moment the final whistle blows, you won't be staying to process the result, celebrate quietly with teammates, or simply rest. You'll be on a plane within hours, crossing back into another country, carrying the physical and emotional weight of a World Cup match with none of the normal recovery time every other competing nation takes for granted. Think about what that actually does to a squad's preparation over the course of a tournament. Recovery after a high-intensity 90 minutes isn't a luxury at this level. It's a core part of how professional athletes manage fatigue, reduce injury risk, and arrive at their next fixture in genuine competitive shape. Ice baths, proper nutrition timing, uninterrupted sleep in a stable environment, these are basic building blocks of elite sports science that every other squad in this tournament has had consistent access to. Iran's players, by contrast, have had to factor border crossings and security screenings into that same recovery window, a disadvantage that doesn't show up directly on a stat sheet, but almost certainly affects performance over the course of a demanding group stage. For Iran's fans, particularly the diaspora communities scattered across the host nations who showed up to support the team despite their own complicated feelings about their home country's government, the experience has been similarly layered. Watching your national team compete at the sport's biggest stage, while also knowing that team faces obstacles no other competitor in the tournament has to think about, adds a dimension to following this World Cup that most fans of other nations simply don't have to carry. Some of those same supporters have spoken publicly about the strange duality of wanting their team to succeed on the pitch, while holding deeply critical views of the political situation surrounding the squad's participation, a tension that's been visible in stadiums throughout this tournament whenever Iran is played. So where does this leave things heading into the final stretch of the group stage? The best-case scenario is that this adjustment ahead of the Egypt match represents a genuine, lasting shift, rather than a one-off accommodation tied specifically to this single fixture. If Iran advances to the knockout rounds, the question of how their travel and basing arrangements get handled going forward becomes even more significant, given the increased stakes and tighter turnaround between matches that the knockout stage typically demands. A round of 32 match followed by a potential round of 16 fixture just days later would make the kind of 5-hour border crossings Taremi described almost untenable from a pure sports science perspective, regardless of how politically sensitive the broader situation remains. The more uncertain scenario is that this remains an isolated, match-specific easing of restrictions rather than a broader resolution to the underlying logistical disadvantage Iran's team has dealt with since the tournament's earliest planning stages. Iranian officials have made clear their formal complaint to FIFA addressed the entire pattern of restrictions, not simply the travel windows around individual fixtures, and whether the rest of those concerns, including visa access for support staff, restored ticket allocations for traveling fans, and unrestricted media access get meaningfully addressed, remains to be seen. FIFA itself has stayed relatively quiet on the specifics publicly, leaving most of the detailed commentary to come from Iranian officials and players directly, rather than from the tournament's organizing body. There's also a broader question worth considering about what this entire situation means for how future World Cups get planned and awarded. Co-hosting arrangements across multiple nations, like the one used for this tournament, inherently create scenarios where a team's relationship with one host country might differ dramatically from its relationship with another. Iran's situation, while extreme, raises a structural question that FIFA may need to grapple with more directly before any future multi-nation hosting bids move forward, about how a team's basic logistics get protected when geopolitical tensions exist between that team's nation and one of the tournament's hosts. So here's where things stand. Iran arrived at this World Cup facing logistical circumstances unlike anything any other team in the tournament has experienced, forced into a base camp in a different country entirely, enduring 5-hour journeys for trips that should take under an hour, and being told to leave the host nation almost immediately after their own matches. Their coach called it the most oppressed situation in the entire competition. Their federation filed a formal complaint, and now, just days before a decisive final group game against Egypt, there's been a real confirmed change in how their entry into the United States will be handled. What do you think? Does this shift represent genuine progress, or is it simply a narrow accommodation tied to one match? And how much do you think these extraordinary circumstances have affected Iran's performances so far on the pitch this tournament?